Well, today we had a record-breaking seizure at the port of Houston. Federal agents intercepted hundreds of thousands of kilos of chemicals headed for Mexico's notorious Sinaloa cartel.
A massive drug bust in Worcester County. 110 pounds of the chemical used to make fentanyl was seized, and it's worth hundreds of millions.
What if I told you that enough chemicals to produce 150 million deadly doses of methamphetamine were floating toward American shores this week? Not hidden in some remote smuggling tunnel, but shipped openly in commercial containers marked as industrial cleaning supplies. At first glance, it looked like any other Tuesday at the port of Houston. Workers processed shipments from China the same way they had for decades. These particular containers, declared as benzyl alcohol and N-methylformamide, legitimate industrial chemicals used in everything from pool cleaners to food processing. Maybe this was just aggressive enforcement catching a few bad actors. Maybe these were isolated shipments. Maybe the system was working exactly as designed, regular trade oversight catching occasional smuggling attempts. But Homeland Security investigation agents weren't looking at isolated incidents. They were tracking a pattern that revealed something far more sophisticated. A fully integrated chemical supply chain stretching from Chinese manufacturing to Mexican cartel labs, using America's own ports as the critical link. Smuggling. This was industrial-scale chemical warfare against American communities, hiding in plain sight within legitimate global trade. And the 300,000 kilograms seized this week?
Agents with Homeland Security investigations intercepted the shipment at the port of Houston. Containers of benzyl alcohol and N-methylformamide, both key solvents in making meth.
That was just what they caught. Here's how the Sinaloa cartel revolutionized drug manufacturing. Instead of growing plants, they ordered chemicals. Instead of smuggling across borders, they shipped through ports. Instead of avoiding authorities, they embedded within legitimate commerce. The system operates across three nations. First, chemical production in legal factories across China. Next, commercial shipping through U.S. ports. Finally, conversion in cartel superlabs across Mexico.
Yeah, Piero calls it the biggest cartel chemical bust in U.S. history, and the chemicals were stopped in the last week, shipped from China, and headed for the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico.
The scale is staggering. This single shipment contained 1,300 barrels of chemicals, enough to produce 190,000 kilograms of methamphetamine with a street value of $569 million. The seizure was so massive it required 24 18-wheelers to transport the barrels to secure storage facilities. Everything changed when President Trump designated the Sinaloa cartel as a foreign terrorist organization on January 20th, 2025. Suddenly, these weren't just drug seizures, they were counter-terrorism operations, and that unleashed entirely new legal authorities. This Houston operation marked the first time federal agents used terrorism seizure warrants against cartel chemical supplies.
I want you to visualize that instead of these containers or these barrels.
Because President Trump and Secretary Rubio declared the Sinaloa cartel a foreign terrorist organization, we can now strike faster and hit harder. But even as authorities celebrated this historic seizure, the reality hit. If they intercepted 300,000 kilograms, how many shipments got through? If this was the largest bust in history, what does that say about the normal scale of operations? The pattern tells a disturbing story. 44,000 kilograms seized in March at Houston, 50,000 kilograms seized in May at Long Beach. Now, 300,000 kilograms seized in September, back at Houston. This isn't law enforcement getting ahead of the problem. It's the Sinaloa cartel scaling up faster than authorities can respond. The terrorism designation didn't just change how agents could seize chemicals, it changed how they could think about the entire supply chain. Suddenly, Chinese chemical companies weren't just suppliers, they were potential terrorism supporters. American ports weren't just entry points, they were national security vulnerabilities. 300,000 kilograms seized, 1,700,000 total since 2019. But federal agents estimate this represents maybe 10% of actual chemical flows, which means Millions of kilograms of precursor chemicals have already reached Mexican labs. But from this disruption emerged new capabilities. HSI's 2019 initiative had developed sophisticated analytical tools to identify suspicious shipments before they reached American shores. AI-powered pattern recognition, cross-referenced shipping manifests, predictive enforcement. Panama became a staging ground for seized shipments. Foreign law enforcement began cooperating on chemical interdiction. The supply chain that once favored cartels now worked against them. The chemicals seized this week didn't arrive directly at Houston. They were intercepted on the high seas and consolidated in Panama before being transported to Houston for processing. This represents a new phase of forward defense, stopping threats before they even reach U.S. territorial waters. Ports like Houston transformed from vulnerable entry points into enforcement strongholds. Every container became data, every shipment became intelligence, every seizure became disruption of the entire network. The Sinaloa cartel's activities are not merely criminal, they are acts of terror that threaten our nation's security, said Judd Murdoch, CBP's Houston Field Operations Director. This seizure is not just a victory for law enforcement, it's a victory for every family and every individual who's been impacted by the devastation of drug addiction and cartel violence. The 300,000 kilogram seizure wasn't just a victory. It was proof of concept. Proof that chemical warfare against American communities could be detected, intercepted, and dismantled at industrial scale. This isn't the end of chemical smuggling. It's the beginning of chemical warfare between federal enforcement and cartel logistics. In 2023, more than 3,400 Americans died of overdoses from psychostimulants, primarily methamphetamine. Every barrel seized represents potential lives saved. The operation is part of Attorney General's February 5th directive, calling for the total elimination of cartels and transnational criminal organizations. This isn't about managing the problem anymore, it's about ending it. The Sinaloa cartel built their empire on chemical supply chains, but they just discovered that empires built on global commerce can be brought down by global enforcement.
Even seizing property outside of the United States.
As U.S. Attorney Pirro told reporters while standing in front of the 1,300 seized barrels, "I want you to have a visual of dead Americans instead of where those barrels are, because that's what would have happened." The message is clear. The gloves aren't just off.
Producing these illegal drugs that are killing Americans on a daily basis.
They've been replaced with brass knuckles, and this seizure marks only the beginning of a new phase in a chemical war that's been raging silently for years. The only question now, who scales faster?